Ex-Nazi radar technician reveals the silent convoys moving harassed female POWs between secret camps January 17th, 1945, somewhere in the frozen valleys of Lower Saxony. The radar operator's breath misted in the cold air of the bunker, his fingers numb despite the wool gloves as he adjusted the oscilloscope's dials. Outside, the night pressed against the concrete walls like a living thing. Inside, the green phosphorescent glow of the Würzburg-Riese radar painted his face in ghostly light. Oberfeldwebel Klaus Zimmermann had spent 3 years watching the skies for Allied bombers, tracking their approach vectors with mathematical precision, calling down night fighters upon them. But on this particular night, what caught his attention wasn't in the sky at all. It was on the ground. A convoy moving without lights through the valley below, invisible to the naked eye but clear as day on his ground surveillance mode. A feature rarely used, officially discouraged but technically possible. 6 trucks, moving slowly, stopping frequently, taking roads that led nowhere strategic, nowhere military, just moving. He didn't report it. Something in the pattern felt wrong. Something in the silence of the radio channels, in the way his commanding officer had left specific instructions never to track ground movements in certain grid sectors, told him this was not information he was meant to possess. So Klaus Zimmermann, faithful servant of the Reich, loyal technician of the Luftwaffe, did something he had never done before. He wrote down the coordinates, he noted the time, and he began to watch. By the winter of 1945, the 1,000-year Reich was collapsing inward like a dying star, and in its final convulsions it was trying desperately to hide its secrets. The Allied advance from the west, the Soviet juggernaut from the east, both were closing like the jaws of a vast trap, and between those jaws lay hundreds of installations, camps, facilities that existed in the grey spaces of official records. Some were known: Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen, Dachau. But others operated in deeper shadows, places where the paperwork was deliberately confused, where prisoners were moved constantly to prevent liberation, where evidence was being destroyed as fast as the crematoria could burn it. And among those prisoners were women who had committed the unforgivable crime of being witnesses, of being useful, of being alive in a regime that had decided they should not be. The convoys Klaus tracked that winter were part of a vast improvised network of prisoner transfers that historians would later struggle to fully map. They moved at night, used secondary roads, avoided railways that Allied bombers had turned into twisted sculptures of iron. They carried women whose faces Klaus would never see, whose names appeared on manifests that would be burned before spring. Political prisoners, resistance fighters, Jews who had somehow survived the initial selections, Soviet partisans, French communists, Polish intellectuals, and others whose crimes were never specified, whose files contained only a number and the word Nacht und Nebel, night and fog, the designation that meant they were to disappear without trace, without trial, without memory. Klaus Zimmermann had joined the Luftwaffe in 1938 with the enthusiasm of a young man who believed in order, in German greatness, in the promises of a rebuilt nation. He had studied radio technology at the University of Göttingen, had graduated with honours, had been proud to serve. The radar stations were the cutting edge, the technological superiority that would shield the fatherland. He had believed in the mission. In 1940, tracking RAF bombers felt like protecting his mother in Hamburg, his sister in Berlin. In 1942, watching the radar bloom with American bomber formations felt like standing between civilization and barbarism. But by 1945, something had changed. Not in the technology. The radar still worked, still painted the sky with electromagnetic precision. But in Klaus himself, too many cities had burned. Too many of his friends had died. Too many orders had made no sense. And now, these silent convoys. He expected military efficiency. The Wehrmacht, for all its faults, was organised. Supply convoys moved on schedule. Troop transports followed protocols. Even retreats, and there were only retreats now, followed doctrines. But these movements were different. They were desperate. The trucks broke down frequently, based on their stop patterns. They took circuitous routes, doubling back, avoiding main roads even when those roads would have been faster. They moved between facilities that didn't appear on military maps, installations identified only by local landmarks he had to cross-reference with civilian cartography. And they moved human cargo. He knew this because one night in late January, engine trouble forced one convoy to halt for nearly 6 hours within visual range of his station. Klaus, violating every protocol, every regulation, had taken the station's rangefinder binoculars and climbed to the observation post. Through the optics, he watched guards standing around the trucks, smoking, stamping their feet against the cold. And once, briefly, when a tarpaulin lifted in the wind, he saw faces, women's faces, gaunt, exhausted, crammed into the truck bed like cordwood. One of them looked directly toward the radar station, though she couldn't possibly have seen him in the darkness. Her eyes, even at that distance, even through the grainy optics, carried something that made Klaus lower the binoculars and return to his bunker. The historical record of these transfer convoys exists in fragments, in scattered testimonies, in logbooks that survived when they should have been destroyed. The International Tracing Service in Bader-Olsen, established after the war to document Nazi persecution, contains transport lists that contradict each other, that show prisoners arriving at camps before they officially left others, that document deaths during transfers that never officially occurred. Researchers have identified at least 300 documented convoy movements between January and April 1945, specifically involving female prisoners, moving them between subcamps of Ravensbrück, between labour detachments in Saxony, between facilities that were being evacuated ahead of Allied advances. The actual number was certainly higher. Many convoys left no record at all. What Klaus Zimmermann expected, what his training and indoctrination had prepared him for, was that these movements would be purposeful, that prisoners were being relocated to more secure facilities, or to labour sites, or even, if one believed the euphemisms, to resettlement areas. What he discovered through his unauthorised tracking was that the movements were essentially random. Convoys would travel for 2 days to a camp, arrive, be turned away because the camp was full or being evacuated itself, and then travel 3 more days to another location. Prisoners were being moved not toward any destination but simply away, kept in motion, kept alive just enough to be someone else's problem, someone else's evidence, someone else's crime. He began keeping a log. This too was forbidden. Radar operators were supposed to record only what appeared on their screens during designated tracking windows, only bomber formations and fighter approaches, only the war in the sky. But Klaus used a separate notebook disguised as personal correspondence, and in careful handwriting he documented grid coordinates, timestamps, estimated vehicle counts. He told himself he didn't know why he was doing this, that it was just habit, just the precision of a trained technician. But in truth, some part of him had already decided that there would be an afterwards, that someone would need to know, that these movements would need to be explained. On February 3rd, his logs recorded a convoy that took 8 days to travel 140 kilometres, 8 days for a distance that should have required 4 hours. The route wandered through the Harz Mountains, backtracked twice, stopped at 3 different camps. Klaus later learned, through whispered conversations with a supply clerk who was drunk and talkative, that the convoy had been carrying French resistance fighters, women who had been arrested in 1943 and held at Ravensbrück. They were being moved to Buchenwald subcamps, but Buchenwald subcamps were full, so they were moved again and again. Of the 47 women who left Ravensbrück on that convoy, 23 reached the final destination. The others died en route, exposure, exhaustion, summary execution when they couldn't keep up. Their bodies were left beside rural roads, in forest clearings, in ditches. The paperwork listed them as transferred. The psychological weight of this knowledge accumulated slowly, like snow on a roof. Each night of tracking, each new convoy, each realization that these patterns of movement had no military logic, only the logic of concealment and disposal, added another layer. Klaus had been raised to believe in order. The Nazi state had promised order, discipline, clarity. The propaganda had always emphasized German organizational superiority, the efficiency of the system, the rational management of national resources. Even the camps in the sanitized official descriptions were orderly. Work camps, protective custody, necessary measures handled with Prussian efficiency. But what Klaus was witnessing through his radar screen and his secret observations was chaos wearing the costume of order. It was systematic only in its cruelty, organized only in its determination to erase evidence. The symbolic object that haunts Klaus's testimony, given 30 years later to a graduate student researching Luftwaffe complicity, is the rubber stamp. He mentions it 17 times in his recorded interview. The rubber stamp that appeared on transfer orders, that appeared on manifests, that appeared on documents routing these convoys. It bore the Nazi eagle and the words Geheim und vertraulich, secret and confidential. Every piece of paperwork associated with these movements bore that stamp, as if secrecy itself was the point, as if the stamps could render invisible the trucks grinding through frozen mud, the women dying in the cold, the expanding radius of complicity that included radar operators who watched and said nothing. Klaus kept his secret through February, through March. The Allied advance continued. The radar station received orders to prepare for evacuation, to destroy sensitive equipment, to retreat east and then north. But the convoys continued too, now moving faster, more desperately. Some no longer used trucks but rail cars, ancient rolling stock pressed into service as the transportation network collapsed. Klaus tracked one such movement in late March, a train that appeared on his ground surveillance radar travelling at 15 kilometers per hour, stopping every few hours, taking a week to cover distance that should have required a day. He learned later it was carrying women evacuated from subcamps near Leipzig, moved north toward Ravensbrück, then diverted east, then north again, a wandering path that followed no logic except avoiding the advancing Soviet and American armies. What changed Klaus Zimmermann? He would struggle to articulate this in his post-war testimony. There was no single moment, no dramatic revelation. He had known about the camps in an abstract way. Most Germans did by 1945, even if they didn't speak of it, even if they told themselves they didn't know the details. But knowing abstractly and tracking the actual movements, night after night, watching the dots on the radar screen that represented truckloads of dying women, was different. It was the difference between hearing about a fire and feeling its heat. The difference between reading casualty, statistics and seeing the body. On April 4, 1945, Klaus's radar station received its final order to evacuate. The Americans were 40 kilometers away. The station's Würzburg-Ries radar, that marvel of German engineering, was to be destroyed with thermite charges. All logs were to be burned, all equipment rendered unusable. The crew was to report to a rally point 30 kilometers north and await further orders. Klaus spent the afternoon of April 4th preparing the demolition charges, wrapping thermite grenades around the radar's receiver unit, setting timed fuses, and then, before he lit them, he removed his secret notebook from his personal kit, wrapped it in oilcloth, and buried it in a tobacco tin beneath a marker stone 40 meters from the bunker entrance. He noted the position carefully in a letter he wrote to his sister, using a family code about their grandmother's garden. The letter survived. The notebook survived. Klaus survived. The historical evidence that corroborates Klaus's testimony emerged slowly over decades. In 1947, the Nuremberg trials documented some of the death marches and evacuation transports, but focused primarily on the camps themselves, on the systematic murder, on the gas chambers and crematoria. The prisoner movements, the desperate shuffling of human evidence between facilities, received less attention. It wasn't until the 1960s and 70s when a new generation of historians began interviewing survivors and examining captured documents more systematically, that the full scope of these transfers began to emerge. The International Tracing Service, working with survivor testimony, mapped routes that exactly matched Klaus's radar logs. Dates aligned, locations correlated. The notebook he had buried became a key piece of evidence in a 1978 legal proceeding against a camp administrator. The women on those convoys, those who survived, carried their own testimonies forward. Germaine Tillion, the French ethnologist who survived Ravensbrück, documented in her memoir, Ravensbrück, an eyewitness account of a women's concentration camp. The chaos of the 1945 evacuations, the transfers that moved prisoners in circles, the sense that the SS had no plan except to prevent liberation and avoid accountability. She described convoys where women died standing up because the trucks were so crowded, where guards would shoot anyone who fell behind during forced marches, where the destination changed daily based on which Allied army was closest. Her account, published in 1946, provides the view from inside the trucks that Klaus Zimmermann tracked from his radar station. The transformation in Klaus's perception was not a rejection of everything he had believed, but rather a terrible clarification. He had believed in German greatness, and German greatness had led to this. He had believed in order, An order had become this machinery of death. He had believed in following orders, and following orders meant watching the radar. Screen while women died in the cold. The cognitive dissonance was not sustainable. Something had to break, either his sanity or his loyalty. He chose loyalty. It broke quietly, privately, marked only by a buried notebook and a decision not to report what he saw. After the war, Klaus Zimmermann returned to Göttingen, completed his doctorate in electrical engineering, and spent 30 years teaching at the Technical University of Munich. He married, had children, built a career. He did not speak publicly about his wartime service until 1975, when a graduate student researching Luftwaffe ground surveillance capabilities contacted him. The interview that resulted is preserved in the university archives. Klaus's voice on the tape is steady, methodical, professional. The voice of a man who had spent 3 decades learning to speak about things he once could not speak about at all. He died in 1984, and his obituary in the local paper mentioned his contributions to radar technology, but nothing about the war. The convoys Klaus tracked have largely faded from popular memory of World War II. They lack the dramatic clarity of D-Day invasions or the visceral horror of gas chambers. They are complicated, messy, hard to summarize in textbook paragraphs or documentary segments. But they represent something essential about the nature of Nazi crimes, not just the planned industrial murder, but the chaotic, improvised cruelty at the system's collapse. The decision to keep moving prisoners rather than release them, to let them die in transit rather than leave them alive as witnesses, to maintain the machinery of persecution even as the state itself disintegrated. The recurring image in Klaus's testimony, beyond the rubber stamp, is the radar screen itself. That green glow, those sweeping lines, those dots of light that represented, in clean electronic abstraction, human suffering. Modern warfare's promise was precision, was distance, was the ability to wage war cleanly through technology. The radar operator tracked targets without seeing faces, without hearing screams, without smelling death. It was sanitized, professional, scientific. But the same technology that tracked bombers could track convoys. The same detachment that made bombing raids psychologically possible made observation of atrocity psychologically survivable. Klaus could watch the screen. He couldn't have watched the trucks. This is perhaps the larger truth that Klaus's story reveals, that complicity in the Nazi system was made possible not by exceptional evil but by ordinary distance, by radar screens and rubber stamps, by paperwork and protocols, by the ability to fragment responsibility until no one person felt fully accountable. Klaus was not a camp guard. He did not shoot anyone. He did not design the system. He simply operated a radar and watched the screen, and yet his watching was part of the machinery. His silence was part of the system. His careful technical precision made the network of death slightly more efficient. The women on those convoys, the ones who survived long enough to be liberated, who lived to testify, who carried their memories forward into the post-war world, describe something that Klaus's radar screen could never show. They described the sound of the truck engines grinding in low gear through mountain passes, the cold that seeped through inadequate clothing until it lived in the bones, the taste of snow they melted in their mouths because there was no water, the smell of dysentery and death in the crowded truck beds, the peculiar intimacy of dying together, of holding a stranger's hand in the dark because you were both human, and that was all that remained. They described the transformation that occurred in those trucks, where ideology and nationality and politics fell away, and there was only the basic animal fact of survival, of breath, of one more minute of existence. And they described the strange, terrible realization that the guards themselves seemed lost, that the SS men and Wehrmacht soldiers accompanying the convoys often had no clear orders, no final destination, no plan beyond keeping the prisoners away from the Allies. Some guards would disappear in the night, abandoning their posts, changing into civilian clothes and vanishing into the chaos of collapsing Germany. Others became more vicious, as if the loss of structure removed the last constraints on their cruelty. And others, a few, became almost human, sharing water they shouldn't share, looking away when they should have been watching, making small gestures that meant nothing and everything. Klaus never met any of the women he tracked. He never knew their names, never heard their stories firsthand. But in 1978, when his testimony helped convict a camp administrator who had organized some of those convoys, several survivors attended the trial. Klaus was there too, called as an expert witness to explain his radar logs and confirm dates and routes. During a recess, one of the survivors, a Polish woman named Zofia, who had been transferred 3 times in early 1945, approached him. She didn't speak German well, and Klaus didn't speak Polish, but she took his hand and held it for a long moment, and Klaus understood that she was thanking him. Not for stopping the convoys, which he hadn't, not for saving lives, which he hadn't, but for remembering, for keeping the record, for making it possible to say later that it had happened, that the routes were real, that the dates were documented, that the chaos had a pattern. The epilogue to Klaus Zimmermann's story is written in archives. His notebook, retrieved in 1946, resides in the German Federal Archives in Berlin. His testimony is part of the Fortunoff Video Archive for Holocaust Testimonies at Yale. His radar logs have been cross-referenced with survivor accounts in at least 14 different historical studies. The routes he tracked have been mapped, the dates confirmed, the casualties estimated. What began as one man's private act of documentation has become part of the larger architecture of memory, the way we know what we know about this period. But there's a deeper epilogue, one that extends beyond archives and testimony. It lives in the questions Klaus's story raises about complicity and responsibility, about the small decisions that accumulate into catastrophe, about the watchers who watch and do nothing. Klaus Zimmermann was not a hero. He never claimed to be. He did not resist. He did not sabotage. He did not risk his life to save anyone. He simply watched and remembered and eventually spoke. Is that enough? The question is uncomfortable because the answer is both no and yes. No, it wasn't enough to stop the convoys or save the women. Yes, it was enough to preserve the truth against the deliberate machinery of forgetting. The freedom that the Allied armies brought to Germany in the spring of 1945 was not just freedom for the prisoners in the camps. It was also, in a sense, freedom for Germans like Klaus. Freedom from the obligation to pretend, to deny, to swallow the cognitive dissonance. The freedom to excavate a buried notebook and say, "This happened, and I was there, and I watched." That freedom came at the cost of confronting complicity, of acknowledging that watching was itself a form of participation, of living with the knowledge that precision and professionalism and technical expertise had all been in service of atrocity. The abundance that American forces brought, the food, the medical supplies, the organization that actually functioned to preserve life rather than destroy it, stood in stark contrast to the chaos Klaus had witnessed in those final months. When he encountered American soldiers in April 1945, what struck him most was their casualness, their assumption that of course you would feed prisoners, of course you would provide medical care, of course you would keep records for purposes of justice rather than concealment. It was an abundance not just of material resources but of a fundamentally different moral framework, one where human life was the default value to preserve rather than the problem to eliminate. In the end, Klaus Zimmermann's testimony is a story about distance collapsing. The distance the radar screen created, the distance ideology created, the distance that made atrocity possible, all of it eventually collapsed into the unavoidable proximity of truth. He watched the screen and eventually had to acknowledge what the screen was showing him. He kept the records and eventually had to speak what the records meant. He served the system and eventually had to confront what the system was. The silent convoys continued moving until the very end, until liberation made movement impossible, until there was nowhere left to move the prisoners except into the hands of Allied forces. Some women were freed by American troops, some by British, some by Soviets, and some died in just the final days, in the final hours, victims of a system that persisted in its cruelty even as it collapsed. Klaus's radar tracked them as far as he could, until his station was evacuated, until the equipment was destroyed, until the war ended and the tracking stopped. But the tracking, in another sense, never stopped. It continued in archives and testimonies, in trials and historical studies, in the work of remembering that Klaus Zimmermann's buried notebook made possible. The green glow of the radar screen faded, but the pattern it revealed remains, a map of cruelty and chaos, of decisions made and not made, of watching and witnessing and finally, decades later, speaking. The truth about freedom, about abundance, about the difference between systems that value human life and systems that instrumentalize it, is written in those convoy routes. in the distance travelled to nowhere, in the women who died between camps that were being evacuated to camps that were already full, in the guards who followed orders that made no sense except as exercises in cruelty, and in the radar operator who watched, who recorded, who buried the evidence, and who lived long enough to retrieve it and say, "This happened. I was there. I watched the screen, and this is what I saw."